Hello everyone and welcome to this new video. So at this step of this series of tutorials, I thought we could take a little break before next chapter, do a little interlude where I will show you how to start creating things on your own with Blender. So this interlude will be split in two parts. First, we will see together how to create objects. And then we're going to model a small object together in a very simple way, in a very rudimentary way, but it's going to allow us to practice and manipulate everything we learned so far. Let's first see how to create objects in Blender. So overall we will use the Add menu, and we can open this menu quickly with the Shift-A shortcut. And there we have a list with all the different types of objects we can create. Objects we export in STL to be 3D printed are 3D mesh, so we will choose the mesh menu. Other types of objects are very interesting, especially curves. Even the text tool can be interesting to model, but let's start with meshes. So here is everything we can create. We can make planes, so a flat rectangular surface. We can make cubes. We can make different types of spheres, cylinders, cones, etc. So as you can see, these are very basic geometric shapes. That's why we call these objects primitives. To model something, most of the time we choose a primitive that is close to the shape we want to achieve, and then we deform it by moving the nodes of the mesh. There are free add-ons coming with Blender which offer other types of primitives, but we haven't talked about add-ons yet, and frankly everything we have here is more than enough to start. I only use a few of these primitives myself. So let's start by creating a cube. So just click on Cube, and the cube is created. And this panel appears. You can expand this panel, but be careful. It disappears if you click elsewhere than on it. If I click here, the panel goes, and we can't go back to it after that. So let's delete the object with X or delete key, and we start again with Shift-A, Mesh, Cube, and now we are careful not to click anywhere outside the panel. This panel allows us to configure 2 or 3 things when creating the object. So we can, for example, adjust the size of our cube, that is to say the length of the side. So I can tell that the side is 3 meters, for example, but we can modify that later with a scale transformation. Here you can choose whether or not you want to generate UVs. So UVs are the mapping coordinates of an object. It's used when you want to apply textures. And for 3D printing, we don't really care. Then we can choose here how the object will align itself when created. So by default, when created, an object is aligned to the world. But we can also align it to the view. We'll see later that option can be very interesting. You can also adjust the position of an object on each axis as soon as it is created, as well as the rotation. But again, it's something we can do much more simply by using a gizmo afterwards. So in conclusion, a cube is such a simple shape. There isn't much very interesting in this panel. But we will see for other primitives it can be very useful. So talking about other primitives, let's now create a cylinder. So I'm going to move the cube, and then create a new cylinder with Shift-A, Mesh, Cylinder, and there we see that the parameters are a little different. So we can adjust the radius and the height, and that becomes very interesting if, for example, we want to model a base, because the diameter of bases is very important for the rules of the game, and therefore we cannot approximate. So for example, if I want to create a wraith base, the official diameter is 40 millimeters, so I can enter a radius of 20 millimeters. And for the height, actually I don't remember exactly, but the dimension must be close to 4 millimeters. So obviously our object is much smaller, but we have a good primitive to model a base. We will only have to make a bevel, and we will have a regulatory base after print. Then we have this parameter which is very interesting. This parameter determines the number of points of the circular profile, therefore the small points that we see here, or rather the small segments formed by the points that we see here. So by default we have 32 points, which gives us a rather smooth cylinder. I'll increase the height so we can see a bit better. 16 might be enough if you're doing low poly modeling. Conversely, if you want something ultra smooth, you can put 64, and you can even put 128. The more points you put, the smoother you get. On the contrary, if we want a geometric shape with very pronounced edges like a pentagon, then we can put 5 points, which will give us a parallelepiped based on a pentagon. If we enter 6 points, we can make a hexagon. With 8 points, we make an octagon, etc. We do not have to fill the cylinder, as is done here with the cap down and up. Instead of ingon, we can choose, for example, nothing, and therefore it will just create the profile for us without having any caps. We also have the triangle fan option, so as its name suggests, if I display the wireframes, we can see that it will fill the cylinder in this way, a bit like a fan or an umbrella. I'm going to switch back to ingon so you can see the difference, but I'll explain all of this in more detail when we will talk about polygons in a future video. We also find the alignment options, and we will stop there for a moment because with a cylinder this option is much more interesting than with a cube. So let's say I want to create a magician's hat, for example. So first let's delete this object and then create a new cylinder with Shift A, and this time we're going to put a little bigger values. We're going to give it a radius of 15 centimeters and a height of 40 centimeters, and we're going to give it a few more points to smooth it all out. If we want our hat to be oriented upwards, so place straight, well, as it is now aligned to world, it's perfect. We don't have to do anything more. So to complete this hat, we just have to create another cylinder. This one will have a slightly larger radius, but will be very flat with a low height. Perhaps a slightly shorter radius, and there you go. I just have to move down the base of my hat with Z, and that's it. We've finished our magician's hat, and for that we just needed to move an object without having to orient anything. So let's say now that I want to create a dumbbell. So I remove the hat, and I create a new cylinder which will be the weight of the dumbbell. So something flat, let's say 3 centimeters in height, and a radius of 10 centimeters. If I want the cylinder to point straight in the right direction, I can of course rotate it 90 degrees. But I can also directly snap to a side view. So I switch to orthographic projection mode and tell Blender to align my object to the view. And my cylinder is created directly with the correct orientation. It saves us a second or two, but multiplied by all microseconds we can save. It's the kind of little manipulation that combined saves us a lot of time. To complete our dumbbell, I duplicate the first weight with Shift D, and I move it along X by hitting the X key on the keyboard. Then we will create another cylinder with Shift A, cylinder, and that will be our handle. So again, I align my view on a side view, and then I align the cylinder to the view. We will say that the handle is 1 meter long, with a radius of 1.5 centimeters. I center it, but it's a little too long, so we're going to scale it on X. And here we have completed our dumbbell. We went around for the cylinders. Then what is interesting? We have the spheres. So there are several types of spheres. We have, for example, the icosphere. I don't really know what does it means, but for me, it's a kind of geode. We also have the UV sphere, which has square faces, because it is sliced on 2 axes, horizontal and vertical axis. So it's a bit like an Earth globe. We have the equator here, we have latitudes, longitudes, and we also have the 2 poles here. So the parameters are quite simple. We are able to adjust the radius, and we can adjust the number of segments, i.e. the latitude slices, or the number of rings, therefore the longitude slices. This simply allows us to give a more or less important density to our sphere. Then what do we have? We have the cone, but frankly I've never used it. You will see when we'll start polygonal modeling it is much easier to make one yourself from a cylinder, but that doesn't mean you should not use it. Then what do we have? There is not so much useful primitive actually. We have the torus, so the torus can be useful because it would be a bit boring to achieve this ourselves. Though there is other ways to make a torus more quickly. So basically you see that we don't use that many primitives. We also have the plane, which is very interesting. We'll use it a lot, but they're nothing simpler. We just change the size of this plane and that's all. So that's it. There is nothing simpler than creating a primitive object, and you will see, just with few primitives, we will be able to start doing a lot of things. And that is what we're going to see together in the next video, that I invite you to watch right now. See you in a minute.